Good afternoon and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type out your question. And now, with no further ado, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening. I've discussed it in the past, and the procedure of how we decide what the topic is for the weekly webinar is that Stacey asks me for a title on Saturday night, something like that, or at least I see it Saturday night, and I have to try and decide what to talk about already 4 days later. And in many areas of the world, that may be sufficient to understand what the topic is. This week, again, it's changed massively. But I did say in the title, we talked about Iran because on Saturday and Sunday, that was the issue here. But certainly we've moved on. But I think it's really still important to talk about Iran because there's a lot going on there, obviously. There's the talks taking place to try and return the US to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. There seems to be a lot of interest, both Iran and the US seem to want to return to the JCPOA deal. Iran are trying to put a lot of pressure, registering officially that they are enriching uranium to 60%, which is extremely high and way, way higher than anything in the agreement. And a relatively short technical step from the 90% needed for weapons grade material. What is most important about this is that even if in the agreement, whatever's agreed, that Iran is then pushed back to lower percentages of enrichment, they now have the know-how, they have the science, they have the understanding, the knowledge to be able to get back to that point very, very quickly. So even if we do, sort of push the weapons or the nuclear program back a little bit, it seems that the horse has already bolted. The knowledge is there, the know-how is there, and it will be a relatively quick step to get back to that position in the future. So that's something that worries the Israelis especially. There is a feeling in Israel that the Americans are not listening. There seems to be very little agreement. Both sides claim, both the Israelis and the Americans claim that the other side is not sensitive to its needs and its interests. It's clear, at least from Israeli sources, that the Americans are in a hurry to get back to the agreement. Let's say the Iranian side, which is backed by China and Russia, have come out this week and said the talks are very productive and they progress quite far along the road. The Americans have also been a little bit more cautious, but it's clear that the Iranians want to get back to the agreement. The question is whether they're ready to sign it now. The Iranians have elections in the next few months, and there's a big debate whether getting back to the JCPOA now helps the so-called hardliners or the more, let's say, quote-unquote progressives. The difference in Iran between the hardliners and the non-hardliners is sometimes very, very difficult to perceive from the outside. And there are those who say that the Ayatollah, who's more of a hardliner, does not want to give the current regime, the current government, which is less hardline, let's say, this victory before the elections, because he wants a more hardline government. But obviously there's obviously politics going on in Iran around that, but they're trying to give the impression they're not in a hurry. The Iranians, as has been said, are very good at playing a weak hand, and they do have a weak hand. Their economy is crumbling. They need the sanctions relief badly. Everyone should know that, but unfortunately, it seems at least that the Americans are not playing that hand sufficiently, and it seems like it's only a matter of time before there is a return to the JCPOA. Israel is so worried about the situation and that they're not being listened to, it, even if they understand that there will be a return to the agreement. They want to make sure that there are certain elements in there, whether it's ballistic missiles, whether it's clamping down on Iranian proxies like Hezbollah. These are issues at least Israel wants America to press during the negotiations, and it is sending an extremely high level. I can't remember the last time such a high level delegation was sent to the US, and next week, the head of the Shin Bet, the head of the Mossad, the IDF chief of staff will all be going to America really to try and press the case of Israel, why this is a bad agreement, and if the agreement is going to go ahead, what needs to be in there. So we wait to see what's going on there. What I alluded to in the title of the talk was the fact that some are accusing Israel of using, or at least Prime Minister Netanyahu, of using the Iran issue and setting off this sort of high intensity shadow war with Iran to try and bring his right-wing allies or potential allies into the government to press the need for such a government to deal with the threat of Iran. And it's clear that every single speech that Netanyahu, his proxies, have been giving over the last week, they have mentioned what's going on with Iran. It also mentions the ICC and other things. So it's clear that at least that's part of the strategy, whether it's just coincidence or not, that remains to be seen. But what is clear over the last few days is we talked a couple of weeks ago when Netanyahu got the mandate to form a government that he certainly had a massive advantage now, and it was his to lose. It now seems that the momentum has certainly turned away from him, and it's now a situation where Netanyahu feels a lot of pressure. For the first time in a long time, he's on the back foot, and he himself conceded that it's unlikely, if not impossible at this point, to form a government. So much so that he's not even talking about forming a government now. He's even changed strategy. First of all, we should look back over what's happened in the week. And we've talked in the past about the crucial, if relatively bureaucratic, Arrangements Committee. The Arrangements Committee is the first committee created after elections or after the Knesset has been formed and sworn in, which is a temporary committee which decides who's going to fill all the other committees, whether foreign and defense, the economic ones, the social affairs, whatever it is. There's temporary committees until a government is formed. But most importantly, they also control the Knesset agenda. And there's a lot of talk on all sides of trying to pass laws, maybe to stop Netanyahu being able to run or other things. Remarkably, this was really a big shock for all, especially Netanyahu. He lost the vote for the Arrangements Committee, and now the anti-Netanyahu camp has a majority within that committee. Interestingly enough, it still controls the committee, or at least it has the chairmanship. Miki Zar, which is a Likud loyalist to Netanyahu. So it's chaired by Netanyahu camp, but there's a majority for the anti-Netanyahu camp, the so-called change camp. So basically, it's going to be stifled. There's very little that's going to be able to be passed through that committee at this point. And that was a huge blow. And it was pretty much dealt by the Ram party, the Islamist party that we've been talking about now for a few weeks. Basically, Netanyahu had spent the whole day in the lead up to the vote trying to persuade Bennett to vote with his bloc. And in the end, he managed to do that. What he didn't manage to do, or perhaps ignored, neglected, whatever you want to talk, whatever term you want to say, is the Ram party. And Lapid, the head of the opposition, wasted no time in meeting with all members of his camp and all potential members of his camp, including Mansour Abbas of the Ram party, and succeeded in convincing him to vote on his side. And in so doing, received a majority and took over at least the majority in the Arrangements Committee. Now that is extremely crucial. It was a big blow for Netanyahu. What basically is happening now is tonight we've had really mutual recriminations between Bennett and Netanyahu. It's clear that there will be no Netanyahu government unless something happens in the next few days. And as we've said before, you never bet against Netanyahu and you never bet against surprises in Israeli politics, but it does seem that momentum has certainly moved away. We always said that even with Yamina, Naftali Bennett, the party was still shy of 2 votes. Netanyahu wanted to rely on Ram from the outside. Bezalel Smotrich made it clear from the beginning and has not moved an inch that he will not go into a government supported by Ram, even on the outside. He even said it's preferable that the change camp form a government to that. So Netanyahu, even with Bennett, does not have the majority, but he's decided to take a course of accusing Bennett. Now we had press conferences, or speeches at least, from both Bennett and Netanyahu. Usually, as what happens, Bennett decided he was going to talk 8 o'clock primetime news, explaining his point of view on this. And suddenly we heard Netanyahu was going to have a response 40 minutes later. Bennett came and basically said quite simply, I want a right-wing government. He said it many times. I'm prepared to give my support to Netanyahu. But it's clear Netanyahu does not have a government and he's not serious about it. His one key throwaway comment is if he's not going to form a government, he feels that no one should form a government. This is what Bennett basically said, saying that for the first time that he is not just open, but he will even try to form what he calls a broad national unity government, which basically is the change camp plus him. So that was the first time he said it. Netanyahu came on, gave a very, let's just say, heated response. He wasn't his usual calm self. And there are some people like Avigdor Lieberman that said he's never seen him so spooked, so scared, so threatened. And certainly Netanyahu was not his composed self, and basically heckled Bennett and said that it's impossible that in a democracy, a party with 7 seats can form a government. And he was never serious about it, and all his interests are in his own ambition. What Netanyahu is trying to do as a sort of last resort, or he's trying to make it the issue, is saying that to try and break the political paralysis, let's try something new. And what he's come up with is, let's have, instead of an election for the Knesset that we've already had 4 times, the next election should just be over the lead of the prime minister. Now, Israel has had direct elections for prime minister in the past, but they were always coupled with parliamentary elections as well. Israel is a parliamentary democracy at the end of the day. It's not a presidential system. So we would again have to change the constitution, something which Netanyahu has said many times, that he would be against changing the rules of the game mid-game. He claims he has the majority of the support of the Israeli public, even though the elections displayed something else. But what he's trying to do is he knows that he is singularly the most popular leader in Israel, even if he doesn't receive a majority. But what he wants to show is that he is more popular than anyone else. What is still unclear, and a lot of commentators are asking, is how this will break the political deadlock, because even if they do create this law, which it's unclear if he even has the majority to bring and pass this law, even if he does, how does that change the numbers in the Knesset? Because to form a government, you still need that 61. And that 61 just doesn't appear. Netanyahu is probably relying on the fact that if the country votes for Netanyahu, that will convince others that they have to come with him. Maybe Gideon Saar, Naftali Bennett for sure, but that's not clear. And it's unlikely, if not impossible, to write a law to force parties to join a government. And it's not even clear that it will pass legally, such a new rule to the game, as we said. So that's where we're holding at the moment. It seems that Netanyahu will not be able to form the government, whether he gives it up at this point or holds out for another 13 days, trying to see if there'll be any changes, remains to be seen. There's also talk of possibly trying to replace him. Likud officially are denying anything, but there is talk. There's talk of Netanyahu giving it to someone like Yoav Levin. Yoav Levin is the Speaker of the Knesset, considered very loyal to him, probably the most powerful member of the Likud that is loyal to him, which is no coincidence. That's why the name's been brought up. But he's certainly not the most popular person in the Likud after Netanyahu. And we are starting to hear voices. We heard Chaim Bibas, who is the mayor of Modi'in, and most importantly, the head of local authorities throughout Israel and an important member of the Likud. And he said that he kind of hinted, and maybe even a little bit further hinted, that perhaps it is time for Netanyahu to go. So we are starting to hear these voices. I don't think they'll get loud quite yet. If Netanyahu hands back the mandate, the question is, will the president then hand it over to Lapid, Bennett, or someone else? or will he just give it back to the Knesset, which means that within, I think it's 14 days, 61 signatures have to be handed to him, recommending one particular person to be able to form a government, and then they get, I think it's either 14 days or another 28 days to form that government, or whether he will then give that chance over to the other side, to the change camp. It's clear that the change camp is negotiating. Bennett and Lapid are meeting. There are some things still to be worked out there. For example, who will control defense ministry, who will go first in the rotation. But again, they have that problem of not being able to have 61. They have only 58 on their side. But it's possible that they will have Ram back in from the outside, and maybe even members of the joint list. Bennett would prefer Ram. Lapid would prefer members of the joint list. So there's still a lot to go, and fifth elections is certainly not out of the question. Probably looking at this point the most likely, even though the change camp are considered, very happy with the week's events, and it's possible that they may have something up their sleeve. There's talk of the ultra-Orthodox parties crossing the aisle, perhaps leaving Lieberman and Meretz out of the equation, and then they wouldn't have to rely on any of the Arab parties outside. But that would still remain someone like Lapid, who opposes the ultra-Orthodox agenda, sitting together with them. So it's possible, and there's a lot of posturing, as usual. But we'll probably know more in the coming days. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question we have in is, in the past elections, the prior three to this one, how much has changed?
4.
Yes. Oh, 4 to this one.
Yeah.
So 3 before this fourth
3
one.
before this one. Okay.
Yes. So how much have the seats actually changed during all the different subsequent elections?
I mean, if we're talking about the blocks, there's been new parties in some of these elections. Obviously, Gideon Saar's party didn't exist until these elections. Blue and White were a major contender in most of those elections, polling in the 30s, and then in the end polling 8, but that was just Gantz without the others. The blocks on the whole haven't changed. If you want to classify all the right-wing parties, they're still in the ascendancy, as Netanyahu pointed out, as others have pointed out, but there are at least 3 parties on the right, whether it's Yisrael Beitenu, New Hope, and Yamina, who have called for a change of leadership. So Netanyahu is a little bit disingenuous when he says the right wing is in the ascendancy, so they support me as prime minister. If that was true, then he would easily have a government and we wouldn't be having this conversation. But so that hasn't changed too much, although it could be argued that some of the votes on those so-called right-wing parties have come from the left or the left of center. But it's, as I've said from the beginning, Israeli elections these days are won by 1 or 2 seats. So even if there was a massive movement between the blocks, the fact remains that 1 or 2 seats is the difference between a government and not government. We saw after the first elections, Netanyahu only had 60. That really makes the difference between the fact that he was and wasn't able to form a government. And we've been in this political paralysis ever since. So it's very hard to go into exactly what's changed in each election because there are so many numbers to think about. But the fact remains that Netanyahu has never received in any of these elections 61 seats which will sit with him, which have said before the elections will sit with him. He managed to form a government with Gantz, who categorically said he wouldn't sit with Netanyahu. So those who vote for a party which have said absolutely they're going to stand by Netanyahu have never received a majority in any of the elections. So it's a hard case to make that Netanyahu won any of his elections. Up until now, he's either managed to, sort of stifle an opposing camp forming a government, or he's formed a government with those who basically come from across the aisle. So it remains to be seen what will happen if we have a 5th, a 6th, or 7th election, especially if Netanyahu remains committed to his seat in Balfour House.
Thank you. So in the event that Netanyahu was out of the picture, would relations with the Biden administration improve?
I think so. There's no love lost. Many people in the Biden administration are leftovers from the Obama administration, or at least from that line of thinking. and they will not forgive or forget Netanyahu, what he did with Obama. Now, a lot of Israelis supported what Netanyahu did with Obama, going to Congress, arguing in front of him, and all this sort of things. But it embarrassed them. They were seething with these attacks. And it's clear the fact that Biden, it took him, 4 or 5 weeks to call Netanyahu. That's very rare for an American president, to leave it so long to speak to an Israeli prime minister. So there's certainly a lot of personal animosity. I don't know if it's necessarily between Joe Biden himself and Netanyahu, but certainly a lot of the people that he's surrounding himself with. So probably someone else in the prime minister's office would get a certain amount of, let's say, space to try and define themselves anew with the American administration. But it remains to be seen who exactly that would be. So we'll see what happens.
Thank you. And I know you touched on it earlier, but what exactly is the impact of the defeat of Netanyahu's candidate for the Knesset Arrangements Committee?
Well, it wasn't his candidate because he won the chairmanship, or he won the chairmanship by virtue of being the person who has the mandate to form the government. But they lost a majority within that committee. I think there's 15 members of the committee, and the Change Camp has 8 or whatever it is. Basically, the Change Camp has the majority. It's massive. It basically means that Netanyahu will not have an easy ride passing any law, whether he wants to pass a law involved in this court case, whether he wants to pass a law now that he's seeking to have direct elections. It certainly won't be easy. He has reached out tonight to Ram. Apparently, this was the first call he's made to Mansour Abbas after elections, considering how much there was talk of them relying on Ram. It's quite interesting that this was the first time that the two actually spoke. Interestingly enough, Netanyahu has even tried to reach out to Meretz, to Labour Party, and to Benny Gantz to try and see if any of them can be offered anything to support this initiative of direct elections. I don't know what he could offer them that would allow them to vote for basically what is a Netanyahu game plan. But it's clear that maybe there is something there. So it's still not a done deal. It could be that Ram, even though they're, as I said, that the Change Camp has the majority, it could be that 1 or 2 votes or even abstains on an important particular piece of legislation. It could be that that will go through. So it's certainly a massive blow for Netanyahu, but it is something that could perhaps he could bring back in his favor. But at the moment, the numbers are not good for him.
And in the weeks leading up to this, we've spoken about Netanyahu courting Ram a little bit. Why do you think they were neglected this time?
Well, according to, basically after this, the star of the moment was Mansour Abbas. He was invited to every single show, every single news. Members of his party, people are close to him in the Arab media were invited. And basically the bottom line seemed to be that he wanted to send a message that he's in nobody's pocket. It's clear from what happened on the day that he was neglected. Maybe he wanted to send a message to Netanyahu. You can't just think that I'm with you no matter what. Lapid offered him a better deal because, as I said, the Arrangements Committee is the one that votes to populate all the other committees. And he offered Ram, I think, 4 committee chairs, which is quite unusual considering they only have 4 members of Knesset. But again, Lapid maybe took a leaf out of Netanyahu's book and basically said, I'm going to offer you the earth for support. I mean, it was such an important vote that Lapid decided to really to go all out. And I'm sure he had the support of all his partners in the Change coalition to do so. It's clear that there had been a lot of work done. And the most extraordinary moment, which was talked about all over Israel, is while the vote was taking place, and I believe it was the Ram vote was being, Ram was voting, Gideon Sa'ar, who sits almost directly behind Netanyahu, gave a wink to someone who was sitting on the front benches, in other words, a Likud minister. And there's been so much speculation exactly what that wink meant, exactly who it was to. A lot of fingers were pointed at Israel Katz, the finance minister, but it certainly encapsulated a lot of what's going on. Here was Gideon Sa'ar, a member of the Likud party up until recently, sitting behind Netanyahu as the Islamist party was voting against the government. Here he was giving a wink to a front bencher. Now that really encapsulated where we are today, because it would be unthinkable a few months ago. But that was really a moment which really captured a lot of the weak shenanigans, for want of a better word.
Thank you. And last week we talked about the budget for the Pfizer vaccines. Can you comment on that and how that's changed?
That has changed, and that was sorted out this week. The coronavirus cabinet was not meeting because of the justice minister's position, as we spoke about last week. They basically found a way to get it through the finance ministry without having to meet. It was a more limited budget for, I think originally they wanted something like 36 million vaccine, which would have vaccinated the whole population 4 times. But in the end, I think they're something like 15 million with an option for more, which is actually more in line with what the health authorities are saying, because we don't know yet whether we'll need a third booster, we'll need more, and certainly whether we'll need it in 6 months or a year. Netanyahu was quite insistent this week that we're going to need one in 6 months. But again, that plays politically well into him because, it's been a success. And if he says, I'm the one who can bring, and we're going to need one in 6 months, that certainly helps him. The head of the coronavirus, the sort of coronavirus chair, of the response, Nachman said this week that that's being very pessimistic. We don't know whether we'll need one in 6 months. It could be we won't need one for a year. It could be 2 years. So there's no sense in saying that for sure we'll need another booster shot in 6 months. But the fact is that the deal has gone through. So Israel is going to receive millions more, which is crucial. If the FDA give approval for vaccine shots for 12 to 16-year-olds, then Israel is going to start that program, which is very keen on. So at the moment, Israel still remains in a good place with the vaccine.
Thank you. So we're getting some reports in that there was an explosion at an Israeli missile testing facilities. Can you comment on that?
I mean, I don't know too much about it. All I've read is that this was apparently prepared, planned, and everyone was given word, but it was certainly spectacular. And obviously not everyone in Israel learned about it. So when photos were spread on social media, etc., it looked like something very unusual. But according to those involved, it comes from those in the defense ministry, which were trying out missiles, and that's what led to it. But that's basically the official line at this point, and I've no reason to doubt it, but one never knows.
Thank you. So going back to the first topic of Iran, in retrospect, do you think that Trump was justified in leaving the Iran nuclear deal?
It was certainly justified because the Iranians weren't keeping to their end. The fact of the matter is that, the whole thing we can look at is where is Iran in its nuclear program? And Iran is extremely advanced in its nuclear program. Iran is, at this point at least, closer than it's ever been. And there's arguments exactly how far that is. And even if they do manage to get to the right amount of nuclear fusion, et cetera, whether they've got their ballistic missile program in line, whether they're able to deliver a payload remains to be seen. But certainly on its nuclear program, it's gone far, far beyond any point which could be useful for civilian purposes. Perhaps there should have been other levels of pressure. The fact is, Iran, as from an economic point of view, is really in trouble. Coronavirus has certainly exacerbated that. You'll find very, very few people in Israel who would defend the original JCPOA, especially its sunset clauses, which basically do not prevent Iran from accruing nuclear weapons. It just pushes it off a certain amount of years. The Obama administration felt that was the best deal they could get. But there is an opportunity now that whether Trump was right or wrong to leave the JCPOA, the fact is that they have that as leverage to push the Iranians back. They can improve on the original agreement. They can have limits on their ballistic program. They can put limits on Iran's proxies. They can bring all these elements into the agreement. Iran will certainly not welcome it, but Iran does want this agreement. They need this agreement. The US wants this agreement. They don't need it. So that really should be the guiding principles, but it seems that the Americans are very keen. The Biden administration is very keen on getting back into the agreement or something close to that agreement. But when you're dealing with the Iranians, you've got to understand what's the reality behind the show. And the Iranians are very, very good at negotiating. And some of the Western powers have basically been led a dance in the past and probably are being led something similar at the moment. And with all the Iranian posturing, it's clear that they need this agreement more than the Americans. So there is an opportunity. Perhaps that's why the Israeli high-level security officials are going to be traveling to Washington next week, really to impress on the Americans. I think at this point, it's going to be very hard for Israel to convince the Americans not to go back to any type of agreement. But I think that there'll be elements there that they'll be saying, let's try and push as much as possible for a better agreement, an improved agreement, a wider, broader agreement. But we'll see how the American administration, their officials, whether they have a high-level meeting or whatever it is, how much they see into that, whether they agree with that, whether they'll push for it, and whether they're successful.
Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week. For our viewers and listeners, please join us tomorrow instead of Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Congressman Jim Banks discussing agreeing with and contesting the Biden administration in the Middle East. How relevant. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.